Hi everyone, my name is Olivia and I'm one of the Chief Adjudicators for the European Championships taking place this year in Novi Sad in Serbia. And this video is part of our judge training program for the competition. I'm going to be chatting about how to come to the right call, a couple of tips to follow, and also highlighting a couple of the new clarifications in the judging briefing. We haven't changed the rules, but there are a couple of things we've sought to clarify and codify where we noticed that there were very different practices with different judges in different contexts. We strongly recommend that all judges watch this video together with reading closely our judging briefing ahead of the tournament. So in this workshop, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, what to credit and how to credit it. Secondly, how to assess new material. And thirdly, restrictions in what we can credit in BP format. Before that, though, I'm just going to chat really quickly about the principles of judging, because when in doubt, this is the thing that you should turn to. So I think it's probably the most important. When you're evaluating arguments and when you're judging a BP debate, I think there's three principles that are quite useful to follow. The first one is a principle of non-intervention. What does this mean? Judges are inevitably going to be quite biased. We all have arguments we prefer, we all have debates we've been in and things we've run, we all have political leanings. But whenever we judge, we need to make sure that we minimize that kind of subjective input into the debate. Because inherently, the more that we involve ourselves, the more subjective the call is going to become. The ideal situation would be for any debate, regardless of who is judging them, to have the same result. That's very difficult to achieve, but we want to come as close to that as possible. What does this mean? When we are judging, we want to avoid biases, we want to avoid preferences, any particular knowledge that we have. We don't want to insert that into the debate. We don't want to insert premises for the teams, we don't want to insert intuitions, value judgments, impacts, conclusions, or rebuttal. And if you ever have to do that because it's the only way to determine a debate or because teams haven't given you metrics on how to assess the debate, then do it as little as possible, using as objective a metric as possible, and please do it in a way that you can justify to the teams. Essentially, we want to judge purely on what the teams tell us, and we want to intervene as little as possible into the debate and just judge the debate that happened. The second principle is quite related, and it's a principle of fairness and also specificity. What does this mean? In BP judging, we want to make sure that we only reward or punish teams for things that they can control and things that they themselves do. This means, obviously, when you're judging, taking a lot of detailed notes and making sure you reward teams for every argument they say, to the extent that it has been proven. Not discard arguments before they've had a chance to develop them. Be willing to change your mind. There may be arguments that you may find personally unoriginal, but they can still be perfectly relevant and perfectly logical in a debate, whether it be arguments about black markets or principles or communism or backlash. There's no arguments that inherently don't win, and you need to give all teams a chance to develop those arguments. Similarly, we ask you to be willing to change your mind on comparisons until the end, as the speech goes along and as new contributions are made, and we ask you to please make sure that you scrutinize your decision as much as possible until the end. Just like when you develop your arguments to make them convincing, you stress test those arguments and you ask, how would I rebut this? Why is this true? What about this rebuttal? Can I be more specific? You can do the exact same process when you're judging. Question each comparison in the 15 minutes deliberation time until you're satisfied that you've considered all aspects to the debate and you can explain that to the teams. Essentially, we ask you to treat the teams and the arguments in the debate with respect, and please make the teams feel like you respected them and you listened to the arguments that they made, and every aspect of what they said was considered, even if not all of it was relevant to the call. We're not asking you to make reference to every argument, but we do ask you to consider it in the adjudication. And the third principle that I think is useful when judging is obviously that judging is comparative. And I hope that everyone coming to EUDC knows this. Throughout the debate, because there's 4 teams and not just 2, we have to compare not only proposition to opposition, but each individual team to the other teams in the room. Essentially, think of debating as a way to save time and to have 3 debates in one, 3 or 4 debates in one. Each team, say closing government, is not only having one debate, but they're having a debate with OG, a debate with OO, and a debate with CO. What does this mean? This means that throughout the debate, as it goes on, you need to ask yourself how you're comparing the different teams to each other. Every judgment has to be comparative. So you can't say that an argument is a good argument or a bad argument or a proven argument or a convincing argument. You can say that an argument is more convincing than another, or that rebuttal is more convincing than another, or that one team gave 3 reasons, whereas the other team gave 2 reasons, but the 3 reasons were better than the 2. So we are essentially asking you to make comparative judgments about who has convinced you the most about their side of the motion. But what this also means is that when you're adjudicating to the teams and explaining the result, you need to explain to them how they place in relation to all the comparisons and in all of the debates that that team was in. That is to say, not only first and second, but also first and third and first and fourth, etc., because the teams deserve to get that result explained to them. And finally, this means that debating is comparative, but it's also bilateral. What do we mean by that? It means that what happens by any two teams can only be affected by what's in the control of those two teams, and a third team's actions shouldn't determine that. There's a couple of exceptions, but broadly, each comparison has to be taken one at a time, has to be taken pairwise, is what we mean. This means, for example, that closing opposition's rebuttal to opening government shouldn't favor opening opposition. If OO don't have that rebuttal, then opening government's arguments may well stand, even if it doesn't stand at the end of the debate when other teams have spoken. Similarly, if opening opposition is losing to opening government, it doesn't matter if closing opposition extends those arguments, rescues them, develops them further. That can't help opening opposition win ahead of opening government because it isn't things that those two teams have done. You'd essentially be rewarding opening opposition for the work of closing opposition, and that's not something that we seek to do. There's obviously examples where a third team's actions can affect a particular comparison. For example, when you're assessing if something has been sufficiently an extension, if it's new enough, or if all other teams have accepted a certain characterization or metric for the debate. But what we want to avoid is things like judging based on what is left on the table at the end of the debate, which would unfairly benefit some teams at the expense of others. So when you're judging, please make sure that you're comparative and you compare teams to each other. And please make sure you take the comparisons one at a time. Compare OG with OO, then OG with CG, CG with OO, and then the same thing with CO. Please don't compare benches at a time. Please don't compare top half to bottom half in one go, because that's not fair to the teams. So those are the principles of judging. Now moving on to the first main part of this workshop, which is what should you credit and how do you credit it? The first thing to point out is that judging is based on arguments. Strictly just arguments and who wins logically and who convinces you of their side of the motion. So we want to look at how well something has been proven, and then once that conclusion has been reached, how relevant and important it is for the round. And those are the two steps to follow. We don't care about things like rewarding the teams that debated the best, give it their best shot, arguments you like the most, but the teams that provide the material that best proves or disproves the motion. So what does this mean? Things like structure, knowledge, style, examples, time allocation are not things that can be used to justify one team placing over another. Okay, those things are mechanisms for persuasion, and those are things that may make an argument more logically proven or more persuasive when it is being delivered. However, we cannot reward them separately or give teams based on and wins based on these factors. That is to say, they're only relevant insofar as they support the logic of the debate and the logic of the argument. If you count them as a bonus, and if it's a very close call between two teams and you say, well, this one had better style, so they're going to place ahead, or this one had better examples, so they're going to place ahead, then you're double counting them. Because they're relevant the first time insofar as they strengthen the argument and how logical you think a team has made their case, and then you're making them relevant a second time when you say, well, given the logic is equal, they added this nice checklist that we like. So we want to avoid double counting, we want to avoid checklist judging, and we just want to ask, how strong is this argument? Those things may well strengthen the argument, but that's not enough to make an argument good. If there is a speech that is very stylistic, but the argument is irrelevant to the debate, we don't reward that at all. If there's a debater that has excellent knowledge and very good use of examples, but they can't link that to any analysis or to an argument that helps them win the round, we don't reward that at all. It is only relevant insofar as it strengthens the argument and the logic of their case. Also, similarly, there's a lot of common justifications for calls that are also irrelevant and also subjective metrics for what's valuable and what isn't, that we don't want to follow. These are things like the number of arguments. It's perfectly possible to have one extension and have that one argument be far more powerful, relevant, and logically proven than the 3 arguments an opening have. So we can't just compare 2 arguments versus 3 arguments, therefore the 3 arguments win. We also don't care about how interesting or original an argument was. Maybe something's really clever, nuanced, and you've never heard of it before, but it may also be irrelevant to the round compared to other arguments. So please ask yourself, how much does it contribute to the debate, not how excited were you to hear it. That's not a relevant consideration. Similarly, other arguments that could have been made, that's not fair. because you're rewarding teams for things that you're thinking of yourself, which may be biased based on debates that you've been in before. Teams may have purposely decided not to run those arguments because they thought something was more strategic. Please don't judge a debate based on a different debate that you wish you would have seen, or reward teams for being the first team to mention one thing that you thought about in prep time that was really clever. You may be wrong. Maybe that thing isn't that clever. You need to see how it plays out in the room and how well it is developed. And finally, we also don't care about things like the amount of time spent on an argument. It's difficult, but it is possible to win with an argument that only appears at the 6-minute mark, if that 1 minute is enough to justify it fully. So don't just tell teams to spend more time on arguments. Don't tell teams that they spent too little time in an argument for it to be rewarded. Ask yourself, how much analysis were they able to give in that time, and how much does that play in the round? And lastly, we don't care about how specific or general an argument is. If a team manages to prove, for example, that we should ban forms of hate speech in all circumstances, that can be enough to prove the motion, and they don't need to show that we should ban hate speech in this specific circumstance only. So perfectly generic or general or broad arguments can be as legitimate as specific ones. That's not an extra burden that teams need to meet. So in short, it's not acceptable to give a team a win because you like a thing they said, because they were the first ones to talk about a specific thing or to have a clear structure. Please don't factor those things in. Please just look at the logic. And more importantly, try to avoid checklist judging. Try to avoid giving teams wins because they did good things, like having examples, having structure. Those are things that strengthen their arguments, but they shouldn't be judged separately from the strength of those arguments. This also, the next thing I want to mention is that you should judge debates based on what is said in the room. We ask you to, as I said before, not intervene in the debate, but we also ask you to adopt a different persona of an informed global citizen. This is somebody who is described in more detail in the judging and speaker briefings, but somebody who has a broad, not necessarily very deep knowledge across a wide range of subjects. They will know that there's conflicts taking place in Syria. They may not know the different allegiances and actions of the different factions fighting in Syria, for example. And as the informed global citizen, we ask you to not discard arguments based on your knowledge, based on any expert knowledge that the informed global citizen may not have. We ask you to not fill anything in for arguments based on knowledge that they may not have or otherwise. And we ask you to be prepared to accept whatever teams justify. If there is a premise that a team uses that you think the informed global citizen would know, for example, North Korea is not a democracy, then you can accept it. And it may be challenged, and teams may convince you of the opposite, but it's going to be quite hard. If there's a premise that you think the informed global citizen wouldn't know, something quite complex about, say, French labor laws, you can be willing to accept it if it's asserted, unless something is asserted to the opposite, and you may require justification for that to be considered proven. Even if you know it to be false, being an expert, as the informed global citizen, you can be swayed one way or the other. What you cannot do in any circumstance is insert a premise for the teams, even if the informed global citizen would know it, because that's filling in the argument. And this is something that you can't do. We ask you to not complete any argument for the teams. If there's premises that they miss, don't fill them in because they're obvious. If there's a logical conclusion that follows from what they said and you think is also impactful, don't fill it in for the teams. We need to let them explain the arguments themselves. Similarly, don't rebut the argument. There's a difference between spotting a logical flaw that prevents you from being convinced by the argument as the informed global citizen, saying this is a serious problem, this is a premise that hasn't been justified, this is a missing link. That's fine, and then you should evaluate the quality of those steps and how many logical leaps you need to take to accept the argument. But that's not the same thing as, oh, I've thought of a rebuttal to this argument, and crediting that as though someone in the team had made that rebuttal. So absolutely fine to look for internal flaws within the argument, not necessarily counterexamples or things that you would say in response to that argument. Please just judge based on what the teams themselves have said. Normally it's easy because teams will be rebutting arguments for you and they will help you with the weighing. However, sometimes that doesn't happen and you yourself need to assess how convinced was I of this argument. Please bear in mind it's not binary. You don't have to be convinced or not convinced. You can be 50% convinced. That's absolutely fine. Just communicate that to the teams and consider that in your weighing. We did get a question in the last few weeks with our judging questions and answers form, which was, to what extent do I credit an argument that has flaws in a debate, even if this isn't pointed out by the teams? And this is a very good question, and we would say two things about this. Firstly, how do you credit it? The answer is you credit it comparatively, right? As we said before, there isn't an argument that is good or bad or proven or convinced me or didn't convince me. There are arguments that convince you more than other arguments, so that we're more proven or proven sufficiently in relation to other arguments and attacks to those arguments. So the answer is all arguments are going to have flaws, and this is the second thing I'd say. No argument is going to be perfect within 7 minutes or 14 minutes in a debate, so you need to ask yourself, this argument compared to the others, how proven is it, how logically sound is it, and how few logical steps did it require for it to be complete, and compare it to other teams. So ask yourself, how much has it been proven, and make that relative to other teams' arguments, is the answer. We'd say just one more thing here, which is that you also need to pay attention to how the debate develops. Don't just judge based on the headlines, because teams may say that they are going to prove a certain thing, and then turns out they don't manage that at all, but they may still manage to prove something smaller. So for example, they may claim they're going to end discrimination, perhaps they don't achieve that, but that may still allow them to prove that discrimination is going to get better in certain circumstances. So judge the arguments that are proven, not necessarily the arguments that the teams say they're going to prove. And lastly, also please track engagement and track responses to arguments. And be aware that rebuttal and responses that teams give to other teams' arguments can do a lot of very different things. Some rebuttal will be directly straight out ineffective. It will do nothing, it misunderstands the argument, or there are lines of logic that they leave unanswered, so the argument still stands. There can also be rebuttal that sheds doubt about an argument, makes you less convinced, but not entirely unconvinced, so it reduces the probability. Some rebuttal can mitigate an argument and say, this argument still applies, but it applies in less circumstances. So for example, a team may say, sure, banning pornography will reduce its consumption, but it won't completely eradicate it because people will still watch it even if it's illegal. That's mitigation, because they may well be conceding implicitly or explicitly that some people will stop watching it when it's illegal. So be aware of what rebuttal does. And of course, some rebuttal completely destroys an argument. And then compare the arguments to each other accordingly. If an argument has been reduced to be much smaller than what they said, it doesn't disappear. And you still need to compare that reduced argument to whatever contributions the other team is bringing. The last thing I want to say on what to credit is I just want to mention metrics in a debate. Because everything of what we've just said about arguments also applies about metrics. As a judge, please don't introduce arbitrary metrics and add extra hurdles to things that the teams have to prove in order to win the debate. Essentially, we don't want to introduce metrics like who had the best principled argument, who had the best practical consequences, who was the most specific, who had the biggest impacts. The metric of the debate is none of those things, and the metric for the debate changes depending on the debate that we're watching. And essentially, it's whatever the teams say that it is. Judge the debate as it happened and let the teams tell you what arguments are the most important, what principles or what consequences or what stakeholders are the most important. If you decide the metric beforehand, then you're inserting yourself and your own intuitions into the debate. So please avoid doing so. And if you have to, because the teams don't give you a metric, as we said before, make that metric as objective as possible and be prepared to justify that to the teams. That was the first point about what to credit. The second thing that I want to mention in the workshop is comparing roles and what exactly constitutes new material. Firstly, let's talk about extension speeches, because that's where a lot of new material needs to appear, and anything that they say that essentially repeats what their opening half has said is not going to contribute to them placing highly in the round. Essentially, it's something that we ignore as though nothing had been said, essentially. So what is new material to come in extension? It doesn't have to be a completely new argument. A new extension, a new material that can contribute to a team is anything that adds weight to the proposition's case or opposition's case, even in relation to the other teams. So this can be rebuttal, this can be examples, this can be characterization, even analysis on the same arguments that their opening has already mentioned, or impacting and explaining why the arguments of opening are the most relevant and important in the round, and they have additional consequences that are beneficial. All of these things are new valid extensions, and as a judge, you need to ask yourself, as before, logically, how much does this advance the case? Please bear in mind, however, that having an extension is not enough to place above your opening. Indeed, it is the bare minimum you need to do to be able to place above your opening. That extension also has to be better. And as judges, we need to critically compare the two to each other as the informed global citizen and ask ourselves which one convinced us more, which one is the most logically relevant. And I do notice a couple of problems in how some judges judge extensions, where they basically say, OG say these things, and then they list the additions that CG says that is new, and then they say this is more. As we said before, it's not enough to judge by number of arguments. You need to ask yourself, what are the conclusions? What are the key logical links that they're providing? Which one has the biggest contribution that convinces me more? It requires essentially an objective, but a critical evaluation. You can't just sit back and count the number of arguments. So possible ways of doing this is, does one team provide key logical links without which the argument of the other can't apply? Does one team justify why their argument is more important, or their stakeholder or benefit is more important than the other? Do they counter the most relevant contention from opposition, which stands in the round? For example, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, but please ask yourself logically who contributes more, and then compare the extensions accordingly. The team that wins of the two should be the one that contributes the most to advancing their side of the debate in the round. And secondly, let's talk quickly about new material and summary, because I also think there's a lot of confusion here. This is broadly quite permissive. In summary, you're not allowed to have entirely new lines of analysis. You're not allowed to have new arguments that haven't appeared earlier. And the reason for this is that other teams can't be expected to rebut them. In the case of closing opposition, there's nobody that has a chance to respond. In the case of closing government, there's one person, but the same principle still applies. It's too late, and the arguments should only be appearing in extension. However, having said this, there's still a lot that summary speakers can do. They can add new examples, characterization, impacting. They can develop and reconstruct the previous arguments and explain why those arguments were very important and win the round. They can respond to rebuttal from the other teams, and they can even strengthen the analysis and strengthen the argumentation as long as the line of argument is the same. Basically, the rule of thumb is, to what extent could this argument or this contention or rebuttal in summary be expected from the extension speech, so that teams could have had a chance to respond? So it's okay to develop the arguments as long as that argument could have been expected. That's roughly the rule of thumb in summary. Even rebuttal to opening is fine. Even if it's the very first time that rebuttal to opening government appears is in closing opposition summary, that should be credited. Summary speakers are allowed to have rebuttal to all teams in the round, because all teams can expect that their arguments will be rebutted. One small issue, though, to be aware of is rebuttal that is not really rebuttal, but teams that pretend to be responding to another team's claims, but actually just use that as a platform to develop an entirely new argument. So please bear in mind there's a difference between destructive rebuttal, in which you attack the logic of a team's claims, or you explain that it's not important, or you say that it's implausible, and contributive rebuttal, let's say, in which you say they claim that X is going to happen. Here's a new argument with 3 reasons for why the opposite of X is going to happen. That can sometimes cross the line into having a new argument and a new line of analysis. So please be careful with the difference between giving new reasons for the opposite and just attacking what a team has said and the reasons that they have given. So please be careful with it. And the last thing that I want to mention is restrictions on what we as judges can credit. Obviously, there's an element of role fulfillment in debating, and it means that we need to make sure that the debate happens in a fair way. Contributions that happen in a way that is unfair to teams should either be discounted or expected to meet a slightly higher burden in that comparison with the teams to which it's unfair to introduce these arguments. What do we mean? Firstly, there's cases like new material and summary speeches. Those are things that very clearly go against the rules. We cannot credit teams for the work that they do with completely new arguments in summary because nobody has a chance to respond. Any time that summary speakers spend giving arguments that haven't appeared before and couldn't have been expected and is not a development of previous arguments is time we ignore. That cannot be credited, that cannot help them win in any comparison. But secondly, there's also more nuanced, trickier cases, like cases where there's lacking engagement. One example is when diagonals between opening government and closing opposition, or between opening opposition and closing government. Obviously, the opening team has a reduced ability to engage with the latter team. So to an extent, we do expect the latter team to give opportunities for engagement, for example, by accepting points of information. If they do not do so, then there's a higher burden for those arguments to be comparative, to be responsive, and it's perfectly legitimate for judges to ask themselves, okay, well, if no points of information have been given, and this is a close call, I can ask myself, what points of information could have been given and what lines of attack can I expect opening would have given in that point of information if they've been offered and they've been rejected? In other words, if closing doesn't give opening a chance to engage, we can ask ourselves if opening's material is implicitly responsive or is inherently preemptive of some of the arguments that opposition has and continue that line of argument to see if it responds. And closing may well have a slightly higher burden to be comparative and for that argument to be clearly proven in order to win in a close comparison. In other words, if no points of information are taken when they are offered in a close comparison, this can be enough to raise the burden that closing has to meet in order to win that particular comparison if they haven't accepted points of information, because that's a lack of engagement, that's against the rules, and that's a problem. And similarly, something very similar happens with hung cases. A hung case is something that happens in particular, for example, in opening opposition, when one of the stronger arguments or a very relevant argument to the round exclusively appears in the second speech without having been flagged by the first speaker, without being able to be expected from the first speaker, being a continuation of those arguments, without being rebuttal, or without being an obvious argument that you could expect from that debate, and therefore teams could have reasonably been expected to predict. If this happens, then the same thing applies as when you're judging a diagonal, and there's a slightly higher burden for opposition to meet to let opening government engage. Note, firstly, this only applies with opening government. Those arguments are still perfectly relevant, 100% credit when you compare them to bottom half, because both of them have an opportunity to react to them, but it only applies in opening government. And secondly, it only applies to the arguments that are exclusively made in the second speech without an opportunity for them to engage. When this happens, please ask yourself if there have been opportunities to engage, for example, in points of information, and if not, then please feel free to consider that they need to meet a higher standard in order to win in the comparison with opening government. We don't want to change the rules, but the only thing that we do want to address is teams purposely saving the best argument for last and purposely denying an opportunity to opening government to engage with that. The last thing that I'm going to mention in the workshop is contradictions. Because contradictions is one last thing that we cannot credit, and it's something that judges need to factor in. If a team has two contradictory lines of analysis, their opposing teams, or their closing half, cannot be expected to respond to both of those lines of analysis, and apart from that, it's clearly unpersuasive. So judges need to have some kind of metric on how to address contradictions when they happen. The first thing to say is that judges should factor in contradictions in calls, even if they haven't been pointed out by the teams. Why? Because even if teams may not have an opportunity to factor them, and teams may not have an opportunity to point it out, it is a problem in the logic of the debate if there's a contradiction. However, if there's complex contradictions that you need to seek out, please don't do this. If there's second or third order contradictions where if you continue an argument to a further logical conclusion or an example suggests there may be a contradiction, don't punish teams for that. That's inserting yourself into the debate. But you can credit them even if teams haven't pointed them out themselves. What is the rule of thumb when contradictions happen? The rule of thumb is that the earlier of the two lines of argument that contradict each other is the one that stands. Basically, teams need to have a clear rule that they can follow, and we think this is the best one, better than other teams being allowed to choose which one they go for. Exceptions exist where this is sensible, and we can think of two cases, but there may well be more. Firstly, if opening opposition, for example, contradicts themselves in the introduction and in the first argument, or if it's clear that they were misspeaking the first time, it's not sensible to bind them to it. Basically, we look at what's the most argumentative, what's the most relevant one, and if we think they misspoke in the other case, then we're happy to consider the second argument and break the rule because we don't think that goes against the spirit of it. Similarly, if all teams accept the second claim to be true, even if the first one is the one that strictly applying the rule would apply, then we judge the debate as it happens and allow teams to say that the second claim is the one that is relevant. Basically, we just want to let the debate happen, we want to not intervene, and we want to make sure that it's fair for the other teams and they can predict what happens. This is discussed in a little bit more detail in the judging briefing, but it's worth mentioning now. The rule of thumb is the first argument goes. If teams agree that they're happy to accept the second argument, or if a team clearly misspeaks, there may well be exceptions. And there's one final question here that I want to discuss, and this will be the last thing in the workshop, is what happens when you're closing half and you're attacking your opening? Because this is a trend that we've seen a lot, which is closing halves purposely marginalizing their opening half and explaining that their arguments are more important or more impactful. There's two things we want to say here. Firstly, in most cases, it's perfectly legitimate for closing teams to do so. It's legitimate for them to say, your argument is less important than mine. That's not a contradiction. If it were, then opening teams would always win because they'd be able to say, my argument is the most important and nobody could rebut them. However, There are cases in which it does cross the line to contradiction, and that is when you seek to falsify the argument that your own opening half has made. We shouldn't treat teams in our own bench, even though we do want to beat them, in the same way as we would treat an opposing bench. So yes, it's acceptable to minimize the scope and to say that it's less important and to provide a metric by which your argument matters more or is more relevant, but it is not permissible in most cases to seek to disprove their point and to seek to disprove their logic. In other words, don't rebut your opening half. You are not their opposing bench. You are meant to be on the same side, but it is okay to out-impact them and explain that your benefits are more important. Essentially, the rule here is that we don't want closing half teams to take advantage of the fact that their opening cannot respond to them. They can't possibly engage, not even in points of information, to their own bench. So therefore, we draw the line at falsification as something that is considered a contradiction, and as a contradiction, it should be ignored because teams on the same bench should be consistent with one another. So, having said all this, these are a couple of the main tips and a couple of the main rules that can help you when you're judging at EUDC. We have a couple of other workshops that can also help you on questions like managing a panel or delivering oral adjudication to teams. And of course, all of this is complementary to our judging briefings, where this is discussed in lots more detail. We hope that this is useful, and if you have any questions, then please get in touch with the CA team. Thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in Novi Sad this summer.